Hello everyone. Thank you all for joining to our first NOICA Talks program. My name is Jabat Bajolu, and I'm one of the board members of NOICA. And I've been a part of the community for the better part of the past 9 years. And throughout the evolution of our growing community, I have been fortunate enough to partake in some of the amazing events and community services within Northeast Ohio. And this one is a prime example of it. I currently hold a bachelor's degree from the University of Akron, and I reside currently at Northeast Ohio. So a bit of background about NOICA. What it stands for is it is Northern Ohio Intercultural Association, which we are here to cultivate friendship and promote the dialogue efforts within Northeast Ohio. We believe that the dialogue and cooperation among the people with different faiths and cultures is an atmosphere that we would like to create with the mutual trust, understanding, and respect. We are here to build and sustain a peaceful and a friendly community with strong intellectual ties among the individuals with respect for all the religious and ethnic background throughout the communication, interaction, and most importantly, educating it. So thank you all again for joining tonight. In our tonight's panel, we have invited Dr. Craig Considine to give us a perspective of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in Christianity. With his recently published book, The Muhammad, A Christian View, he examines the Muhammad's life and legacy, and he provides a sociological analysis of the Muhammad's teaching and example. Dr. Considine shows the Prophet's embrace religion and pluralism, envisioned a civic nation, and stood for the anti-racism while advocating and seeking knowledge. Prophet Muhammad initiated women's rights and followed the golden rule. Dr. Considine sheds the lights of the Prophet Muhammad that is often forgotten by the mainstream narratives. The humanity of the Muhammad, peace be upon him, is Dr. Considine's contribution to the growing body of literature in one's history, which is the most important human beings there is. So a bit about the background of Dr. Considine. Dr. Considine is a scholar and a professor and a global speaker, media contributor, and a public intellectual based at the Department of Sociology at Rice University. He is the author of many books and articles. Dr. Considine's opinions have been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, BCC, and Al Jazeera. He has been invited to speak at many leading international organizations and universities around the world. He holds a PhD from the Trinity College, Master's from the University of London, and a bachelor's from the University of Washington, D.C. Dr. Considine is U.S. Catholic of Irish and Italian descent. So before I like to invite Dr. Considine, I'd like to let our viewers know that there will be a Q&A session towards the end of our program. And we would like to encourage you guys to put in the chat or the comments that if you have any questions throughout the talk or a lecture, please write it down there and we'll try to answer as much as possible because we believe that that is one of the most important aspects of today's session. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Considine on tonight's panel.
Thank you, Javat, for that introduction. Greetings of peace to each and every one of you that has decided to join us this evening. I hope you are doing well in this turbulent time that we are currently living in. I'd like to thank the Northern Ohio Intercultural Association for organizing the event. Mustafa, thank you for inviting me. And I must say, when I read a little bit more about how do you pronounce it? NOICA. Is that correct? Yeah,
yes,
NOICA. Yeah. Cultivating friendship, dialogue, mutual trust, understanding, and respect. Those are things that are dear to me, really important to me, and they have been for quite some time. And they remind me really of what Pope Francis has been talking about for quite some time now, which is the culture of encounter. And he's really pushing all people, not just Catholics, to be fearless and courageous in getting to know the other, getting to know other people, and to truly understand other people and to really get to know them, it takes dialogue. It takes a certain amount of faith and trust in other people to really kind of establish friendships and move us forward in a way that is constructive. So, I send my best to all those involved in NOICA, and I'm wishing you all the very best in all your endeavors moving forward. So I'm looking forward to giving my first talk of 2021, the new year, and we'll be talking about the humanity of Muhammad, which is my latest book, which came out in July of 2020. And I think it's important to start by providing a little bit of a backdrop of who I am and kind of what inspired the book to begin with, because this is a really important component, not only of this book, but it's an important component, I think, of any author. You have to know where the author comes from, what is motivating the author to write the book, and what is, at the core of the person writing the book. And I talk about this in the introduction. If you've had the opportunity to read it, some of this may be familiar to you. But my journey has really been an unexpected one. If you ask anyone that knew me growing up in Needham, Massachusetts, outside of Boston, and my family members, no one would have expected for me to be on this journey that I'm on, and it's a mystery. It's a beautiful mystery. But for me, this really started, and I didn't know it at the time. It started on 9/11. I was a junior in high school at Needham High School. It's a public school. And, everyone knows what happened on 9/11. And for me, there are a few things that really stuck out, and one, and I talk about this in the book, is what happened when classes were canceled and they told us to go home. And I remember leaving Mrs. Nielsen's classroom and getting into the hallway of Needham High. I just remember hearing people chant and shout things that I will not repeat here, but they were xenophobic, they were racist. And these comments were associating what happened with Islam, Muslims, and pretty much Arabs, which is pretty remarkable if you think about it, because it's like 15 minutes after this happened, like 15 minutes after the tower went down, this assumption and this stereotype has already been imprinted in people's minds. Goes to show the power of the media, and people were saying awful things. And the town I grew up in, Needham, 30,000 people, very old town. I think it was founded in, like early 18th century. It's an old New England town. There were no Muslims in Needham when I was growing up. The closest masjid was, I think it's 9 miles away in Roxbury. There was no context to make sense of what I was hearing in the hallway. I had never met a Muslim in my life. And at the time, I was just like, yeah, I mean, you're 16 years old. You don't know anything about what's being fed to you on the media. And unfortunately, I think it's part of human nature. You kind of go down the rabbit hole of believing some of this stuff. Now, to be fair, I wasn't, some raging xenophobe, Islamophobe, or anything like that, or anything malicious. But there were definitely some things in between my ears and in my heart that were not correct about the Islamic faith and about Muslims at large. When it came time to pick a major in college, this is like 2003. To give you a context of the time, the invasion of Iraq just happened. 2 years before that, the invasion of Afghanistan happened. And for those who are old enough to remember the media coverage at this time, it was an absolute bombardment of propaganda. You know, this entity called Islam is out to destroy our way of life. I mean, George Bush, the president at the time, literally said, these people hate our freedom. So I'm in college. This is going off. Iraq caused a lot of controversy in this country. There were a lot of protests saying that this was not right, spreading this idea of weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein is out to destroy all of us. And at that point, I started realizing something is off. This isn't right. Something's fishy. You know, I was in college. Thank God I was in college, and I had good professors who were kind of giving me a glimpse into what happens behind the scenes, politics, propaganda, international relations. So I decided at that point that this is a good subject for me to explore. International relations. That's how it started, politics. So I go to American University in Washington, D.C., the belly of the beast, if you want to call it that. Literally, even today, I say that, and I think a lot of you would recognize the truth in that at this time. But I started taking Arabic classes. A lot of my family members had no idea what I was doing, taking Arabic classes. And I was also taking courses on Islam, trying to understand why something like 9/11 happened. That was like my frame of reference. Like, these people hated us. Why do these people hate us? What explains this? And by God's plan, I signed up for a course called The World of Islam with Professor Akbar Ahmed of American University, who is a great man and a role model for me, and really took me under his wings for many years. He's an anthropologist. I'm a sociologist. There's a lot of overlap. Professor Ahmed is the former ambassador from Pakistan to the UK, so he was also in the diplomatic realm. So I enter into the classroom at American University in the SIS building, the School of International Service, and I sit down and I meet a friend, Ali Khan, the first Muslim I've ever met in my life. And we started talking not about Islam. We started talking about the New York Knicks basketball team. So I was like, this is okay. This guy's a Muslim and he's not talking about Al-Qaeda. Okay, this is different. Then Professor Ahmed starts the class. And he just starts talking about ilm, the Arabic term for knowledge. And I'm scratching my head. I'm like, what? Why aren't we talking about bin Laden? Why aren't we talking about the clash of civilizations? Professor Ahmed is talking about the importance of knowledge. And it blew me away. And he was sharing some of the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, which also completely, ruptured all of this misunderstanding that I had inside my head and my heart. The one that I talk about in the book, the saying of Muhammad, is the ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr. And that changed my life. That one class right then and there, I said to myself, this professor is on to something. And he's talking about the importance of building bridges between the Abrahamic tradition, Christian, Muslims, and Jews. And I said, this guy's got the solution. This is the solution to the problem. Understanding, knowledge, interfaith. So I rolled with it. And I became Dr. Ahmed's assistant, engaged in a project with him called Journey into America, which brought us around the United States from 2008 to 2009. We went to over 100 masjids across the country. We met with Americans of all walks of life, from Native Americans in the Hopi Desert to members of the Gullah Geechee tribe on Sapelo Island in Georgia. And we were exploring the question, what does it mean to be an American through the lens of Muslims? And he wrote a book, a brilliant book, Journey into America, The Challenge of Islam. And we created a documentary, which I miraculously filmed and directed and edited, called Journey into America. And that's online on YouTube. It came time for me to clip my wings, and I embarked upon my PhD. And when I was in Dublin, this is where Prophet Muhammad really came into my life. And another professor, scholar, had a huge impact on me. And this is John Andrew Morrow, the Canadian Muslim scholar who wrote the book, The Covenants of Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the World. And it's focusing on the treaties, the covenants, the agreements that Muhammad had entered with the Christians of his time. And up to this point, this is 2013, up to this point, most of my interest in engagement with Islamic studies was linked to the clash of civilizations. But now, Morrow opened my eyes up to Muhammad, and I started exploring Muhammad's life, especially his relations with Christians, and that essentially produced the book. So let me guide you through some of the key themes of the book. The first chapter is titled Religious Pluralism. And before I get into this, let me just give you a little bit of a backdrop here. Like, the book is academic in nature, but I think most people who have read it would agree that it's very accessible. Like, a high school student could read this and digest it, come away with some deeper theory, but also understand that there's a narrative, it's a flow to it. The first chapter, quite simply, is titled Religious Pluralism. And I distinguish religious pluralism based off of previous theoretical insight developed by Diana Eck at Harvard University. And Eck at Harvard, she runs the Pluralism Project, and she distinguishes pluralism from tolerance. Religious tolerance, she says, is a bit standoffish. When you tolerate something of a loved one, there's something iffy about this toleration, like you just put up with it, and you allow people to be who they are, and you're even willing to put up bad habits, and you don't talk about these things, you don't break them down. And Eck is saying that actually by tolerating people, it's not necessarily a bad thing to tolerate some of these things. It's not like you're committing violence or anything, but by tolerating and by not really getting to know the other, it runs the risk of reproducing some of the old stereotypes, because you really don't know who these people are. If you think about what tolerance might look like, if you're in a room, if wherever you are right now, and we had 4 groups of people in a room, each group has a corner of the room, what would tolerance look like in this situation? Everyone can have their little space, they can do what they want, but there's going to be no cross-cultural interaction. There's going to be no interfaith dialogue between the groups. Everyone can just be. But Eck is saying pluralism moves beyond tolerance. And she defines pluralism as the energetic engagement with religious diversity. The energetic engagement with religious diversity. And it's important to note that this is a process, right? It's a way of living. It's a way of being. It forces you to actually be active as a person. It's not this idea that people often assume pluralism is, like all gods are equal. That's not what Eck is saying. And that's not what Muhammad was saying either, to be fair. The context that I use pluralism in this book is the energetic engagement with religious diversity. And we know on multiple occasions that Muhammad engaged in this process of getting to know the other actively. And in the book, I use the example of his interaction around 630 with the Christians of Najran. And in the late 620s, Muhammad is emerging as a significant regional political figure. And he has his nation of believers and helpers. He's positioned in between two empires, the Byzantine and the Persian Empire. And he's sending out letters to all of these heads of state. So he sent one out to Emperor Heraclius of Byzantium. He sent one out to the Persian emperor named Khosrow, and he sent one to the Christians of Najran. And Najran, if you're familiar with current Saudi Arabia, the geographics, it's in southern Saudi Arabia, right near the border of northern Yemen. And Muhammad invites the Christians of Najran to his masjid in Medina. And, I provide a kind of play-by-play in the book of what transpired, but there are two main elements of this story that remind us of pluralism and not merely tolerance. And the first is the discussion that was had between Muhammad and the bishop and the scholars from Najran who were Christian. And they had a pretty significant, heavy, deep, if you want it, controversial conversation on the nature of Jesus, which at the time in the 7th century, was recently coming off of some significant councils in which Christians came together to figure out, who was Jesus? Was he divine? Was he sort of divine and sort of human? So this was a hot topic at the time, if I could say that. And the sources tell us that there was a cordial civil conversation between all parties involved. And this is a very important element of pluralism. And Eck talks about this. Pluralism in this energetic engagement with diversity is not necessarily a big kumbaya session in which everyone needs to agree on everything. That's a ridiculous proposition, that everyone needs to agree on everything. That's never going to happen, and nor should it. That's not God's will. But we know that they had a civil dialogue, and that there was that people walked away from that dialogue with actual understanding. And this is part of this energetic engagement with diversity. And the second part of this story, which really inspires me, and when I first read it, I couldn't believe it. When the Christians of Najran when it came time for them to pray, Muhammad permitted the Christians of Najran to pray inside the masjid, which even today is almost unheard of. The idea, and this isn't just specific to Muslims, this idea that Christians can pray in a mosque, it's also very unique to Muslims praying in a church. But like the level of hospitality that Muhammad was willing to show his guests is remarkable to me. And I think it's more than merely tolerance. Tolerance would say, oh, you want to pray? Here, let us guide you outside. Let's, we'll watch over you. We'll make sure that you have a safe environment to pray. But Muhammad was doing something different. He was saying, okay, you're here. You're in a house of God. You can pray here. And you would imagine certainly some of the believers, and maybe even Muhammad himself, actually witnessed the prayers, which is really remarkable, even to this day. We see a few examples that have popped up in recent years. I think in 2015, the Washington National Cathedral in DC, our nation's capital, hosted a group of Muslims at a time of heightened Islamophobia. And they allowed essentially the Muslim population to engage in prayer, which is an amazing sign of hospitality. And I think it's important to recognize too, I don't think faith gets watered down by doing these things. A lot of people are uncomfortable with it. And that's fair. But Muhammad was really pushing the boundary and the envelope, if I could put it that way. The second chapter of the book, and by the way, these chapters are quite short. The book is kind of hits you quick. and it's easy to digest. The second chapter is titled Civic Nation Building. And I distinguish, as previous scholars have, the civic nation from the ethnic nation. So when you think of an ethnic nation or a racial nation, I think one of the primary examples, though an unfortunate example, is Nazi Germany. So Hitler and his crowd created a nation that was so exclusive and rigid that only certain white people could belong to. So people kind of forget this. It wasn't just about white people. It was just about a certain type of white people. I, of Irish and Italian descent, would not belong in Hitler's Third Reich. There's no way. And essentially what happens in an ethnic or racial nation, and by the way, we see the ethnic nation in this country right now with everything going on. You know, this white power movement that we see, but that's a different subject. But essentially, how you're brought into this world, what you look like and who your parents are, determines whether you belong or you don't belong. Okay? A civic nation is really the polar opposite of this. A civic nation is one in which your ethnicity, your race, your religion, your cultural orientation, and so on, all of these identity categories do not determine your value or your sense of belonging to the nation. What makes a civic nation civil and civic, and what distinguishes it from the ethnic or racial nation, is the law, the Constitution. And a civic nation is one in which, you know, egalitarian and democratic values reign supreme. So anyone can belong to a civic nation, so long as you believe in the spirit of the law. The United States, if you read the Declaration of Independence, you know, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men, let me say human beings, are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and these are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. There's nothing in there about race, ethnicity, or religion. Anyone can belong to America. This is the good side of America. We, as a nation, it has not always lived up to that billing, but ideally, the United States protects freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, the right to own property, the right to vote for your elected officials. This is a civic nation, and this type of nation is what Muhammad created during the Second Hijrah in 622, when he and the believers really create a revolutionary society in Medina with the various pagan tribes and the Jewish tribes. And a simple Google search will bring up the Constitution of Medina. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. But the point here is that we can apply contemporary sociological concepts to Prophet Muhammad's life. So the Constitution of Medina, just if you just Google it and read the articles, it's, you know, stunningly similar in many ways to the U.S. Constitution. I mean, obviously in spirit, you know, in value, in theory, it's quite similar. So the Jewish people were allowed to practice their faith according to their conscience, according to their community, and that the government would not interfere in the developments of these various religious communities. Right. So it's not the prerogative of the government. And in the Constitution says that the government cannot dictate these things. And the Constitution of Medina also created a mutually dependent society, which is really important. Talk about allyship. So if one member or group that signed up for the Constitution of Medina was attacked, then everyone who signed it must unite and help the people that were attacked. I mean, that is what this country, the United States, has in its Republican framework. You know, like if God forbid if a foreign country attacked Massachusetts, the 49 other states would be right there to assist. This is the type of revolutionary idea that Muhammad is initiating in 622, not 1776, 622. And it was revolutionary because prior to these developments, you had a hyper tribal society in Medina, in Mecca, and the Arabian Peninsula. It was an ethnic oriented peninsula in which how you were born determines who you're going to be in this world. And Muhammad is saying, nope, all that is gone through revelations and through God. Moving on in a smooth transition to the third chapter. And this will be the last theme I talk about. And this chapter is anti-racism. And I set this chapter up in a similar way that I set up the first two. So we had distinguishing between tolerance and pluralism, distinguishing between the ethnic nation and the civic nation, and distinguishing between non-racism and anti-racism. There's a difference, right? Non-racism, to put it simply, is the idea that a human being does not believe in this notion of racial superiority. Unfortunately, a lot of people around the world do hold views of some races being inherently better by birth than others. So non-racism is just this idea that, you believe in human equality. You believe in humanity. We all come from Adam and Eve. At the end of the day, we all have the same organs. When we're cut, we all bleed red type stuff. Muhammad, we know, was a non-racist. But we also, in looking at his life, understand that he was an anti-racist. There's a difference. And it's similar to the difference that we see between tolerance and pluralism. Anti-racism, like pluralism, goes a step further. It's more energetic and it's more active. So when you're an anti-racist, you're actually taking measures consciously to try and dismantle some of the structures in society that produce the racism. And the examples that I use in the book, just a few examples. There's many that you could get into. Actually, the Constitution of Medina is, I think, an anti-racist document because it's actually bringing all of these different groups of people together and uniting them around laws that are kind of colorblind in a way, if you could put it that way. But we know that Muhammad is anti-racist through his relationship with Bilal ibn Rabah. So for those who may not be familiar with Bilal, he was of Abyssinian and Arab descent. He was darker, physically looked darker than the normal Arab, the normal Quraysh tribal member. And we also know that Bilal was enslaved. And there are various recordings of early Muslim historians that say that, people used to kind of harass Bilal, saying like, you're the son of a black woman, so associating his character and conduct based solely on how he looks, kind of a classic racist example. And we know that Bilal was a early steadfast believer in this message that Muhammad was bringing of Islam. And Abu Bakr and Muhammad actually purchased Bilal's freedom, which I think is a great example of being anti-racist. It's like you're literally taking action. You're literally undoing the shackles of someone who is not free at all. And there are other examples throughout Muhammad's life. And the other one that I reference in the book, and by the way, Bilal rises to one of the preeminent positions in the early Muslim community. Muhammad was not simply saying, hey, okay, I'm going to free you. He's saying, you're free. The type of society that I'm creating, you can go to the top, because what we emphasize is not ethnicity and race. What we emphasize is character and conduct. And Bilal rises to, he was a man of many hats. He was a soldier, he was a leader, and he was the muezzin, the person, the preeminent position of the person that calls the people to pray. And then, of course, the farewell sermon. And I'm paraphrasing here, one of Muhammad's last messages to his people at Mount Arafat in 632 in early March was one of humanity and racial equality. So he's telling people, like, an Arab has no superiority over non-Arab. A white has no superiority over a non-white. A black has no superiority over a white, and so on and so forth, except in piety and in good action. So he's telling people, okay, this is anti-racist in the sense that he's saying, this is what my nation is to be in the future. This is what it means really to be a believer. That's a very powerful statement. And I talk about this in the book. Remarkably, in the year 1963, we have Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who many of you know, an African-American, a Christian, who studied in Boston University, my native Boston, and he's a U.S. citizen. And on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, Dr. King gives his I Have a Dream speech, in which he not only talks about racial equality, but he's also reminding us of the civic nation that I recently just talked about. But Dr. King, and I'm paraphrasing, says something like, I hope that one day my 4 children will live in this country and not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. So if you need a good example to remind people that the clash of civilizations, this idea that Islam and the West, or Muslim civilization and Western civilization, are on a, inevitable crash course, you bring up the farewell sermon and you bring up the I Have a Dream speech. Muhammad gave the farewell sermon in 632, right? He's a monotheist. He's a Muslim. He's a believer. He's an Arab from a particular tribe, from a particular region of the world. 1,000 years later, an African-American descendant of slaves from the U.S. South, a U.S. citizen, and a Christian, they're saying the same thing, right? So you have a very simple example busts that clash of civilizations theory. So the rest of the book, the other chapters, which I don't have time to get into today, but the longest chapter, the 4th one, is seeking knowledge. And I kind of take a little detour away from Muhammad, and I look at how his life and his legacy and the sayings that he offered on the importance of ilm, knowledge and education, how these things played out in history. And I do this by looking at the moments in history in which Christians and Muslims and other groups of people came together and really cherished knowledge, learning, science, progress, and what they were able to achieve in doing these things, to remind the reader that Muhammad's teachings did not die when he passed away in 632. They lived on throughout the years. And, I've spoken to a lot of people who have read the book, and a bunch of people have said that one of their favorite parts of this whole entire book was the section that I had on Rumi, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is from Boston. He was a transcendentalist, a Christian mystic, essentially, a lover of love, a lover of peace, an academic, and a poet. And in the book, I talk about not only their love for knowledge, but how their poetry literally like mirrors each other. It's remarkable. It's almost similar to the farewell sermon being so close to the I Have a Dream speech. And if you look at what Emerson wrote and what Rumi wrote, it's just beautiful. The 5th chapter is women's rights. And I focus primarily in this chapter on 2 women that were close to Muhammad, Khadijah and Aisha. And in short, if I could paraphrase this really important subject, by the way, which deserves its own talk. But I put it this way, both of these women were remarkable, even for today's standards. So not just saying, oh, they were ahead of their time for the 7th century. No. These were, bright, fearless, intelligent, successful, loving women, really complete, a complete person that was good at everything they did. And when I find it funny when people say, oh, Muhammad, disrespected women, or Islam disrespects women. So what type of human being, what type of man, let alone a prophet, what type of man would have no problem entering into a relationship with the type of woman that I just described? Muhammad was not afraid of being in a relationship with this type of, powerful woman, outspoken, successful, in some cases rich. He didn't let his ego kind of step into the equation. And he's like, well, am I going to be the inferior member of this relationship? He didn't say any of that. It goes back to that character and conduct. That's what he loved. And that's what he saw in them. Chapter 6 focuses on the golden rule: treat others how you wish to be treated. Very simple, somehow has been forgotten throughout history. It's the message of Jesus, and we know that through the gospel. And in this chapter, I also talk about how that is the message of Muhammad in many ways. And one of the examples, very briefly, that I use, and we know this through the early Muslim historians, when there was a Jewish funeral procession, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this story. Jewish funeral procession is coming down the road, and Muhammad and some of his companions are on the side of the street, and Muhammad sees this funeral procession and stands up to honor it. And one of the companions said, what are you doing? This person's not a Muslim. This person's not part of our tribe. And Muhammad said something like, this is a human soul. What are you doing? This is a human being. Treat others how you wish to be treated. Basic human dignity and respect. Basic stuff. Jesus and Muhammad were extraordinary to never forget that message. And they're also extraordinary, kindred spirits in many ways. And let me remind all of you too, I don't mention this specifically in the book, but oftentimes people are like, well, what's the one thing that Jesus and Muhammad have in common? And the simple answer is love of humanity, which is, I think, correct. But these 2 men were engaging in the old Hebrew saying of tikkun olam, which is to heal a fractured world. Both of these people, Jesus and Muhammad, were living in times in which society had gone astray. It was broken. People weren't being treated well, and people weren't treating each other well. And they were bringing in the parts of society that had been forgotten. We know that Muhammad was bringing, reminding people to treat little girls well. Don't just kill off little girls because you think they're useless. Don't mistreat your women. Don't mistreat servants, and have care for orphans. And if you read the gospel, Jesus was doing the same thing, healing the maimed, the sick, the forgotten people. All of these things are linked to the golden rule. And then the last chapter focuses on Muhammad being the spirit of truth. And I do believe that Muhammad was absolutely bringing truth to the world. And I look at this not through the prism of his theological claims of the Quran necessarily, denouncing and condemning the Trinity. I look at it through his character and conduct and his actions. And to me, his actions reflect a bigger truth that is reflective of who God is, which is an entity that created all of us, into nations and tribes, as the Quran says, so that we can get to know one another. And it's funny too, because there's a Paul, the apostle in Galatians, which is a chapter of the Bible, says something similar. Like you're no longer Greek, you're no longer a Gentile or a Roman. You're all one now in Jesus. So these are some of the themes of the book. I could go on and on and on, but I think it's appropriate for us to open this up a little bit for a Q&A.
Dr. Craig, thank you so much. That was phenomenal. And it's mind-blowing the way you have described the peace and the prosperity that was rising again with the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And you mentioned briefly about Bilal, and one of my favorite events that happened during the Prophet Muhammad's time is when the first migration happened, that they moved to the kingdom of Abyssinia. And because the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, knew that the Christian king was just and accepted, and he would listen to the people before prosecuting them. And this shows a great interaction between the people that was around Prophet Muhammad and the knowledge that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had among the Christian community, that he knew that the prosperity and the justice was alive during that time. And he trusted the Christian king the first when he sent his own people from the oppression. And you mentioned the last sermon, and I actually looked up, and this is one of my favorite quotes of all time from Prophet Muhammad too, is he says that all mankind is from Adam and Eve, and Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, or non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Also, white has no superiority over a black, nor black has any superiority over white, except piety and good action, which is perfectly aligning with what in the Bible it says. So it's amazing that there's these two amazing books and these two amazing religions with two amazing men preaching almost word to word the same thing. And it just shows that there is an amazing and a large common ground. So I think your book and your vision perfectly exemplifies the Christian view and what it's like to be a Muslim, and then see it from your side of what is being perceived as.
So can I say something real quick before we get into the questions? Because the first hijra is, I touch upon it in the book, but not to distract us too much from this book, but like my next book, I have a whole chapter on this interaction of the first hijra. And let me just quickly say this. If King Ibn Abjar was not who he was, what would have happened to the early Ummah? It's a serious, like, historical question, because he not only provided them refuge, he not only said, you can come here, but he literally protected them. The Quraysh were in his court when the believers were there. And he literally, the sources tell us that he picked up a stick and he drew a line in the sand, and he basically said that the differences between the Christians and the Muslims are about as wide as this line. And then he also went on to say to the Quraysh that I will not give up these people for a mountain of gold. And then he turns to the believers and says, you are safe. you are safe in my kingdom. I mean, talk about allyship and what it means to stand for humanity. I mean, what a example, what a marvelous example. And that, for me, that makes me proud to be a Christian. That's what it means to be a Christian to me. And I want more Christians, especially in this country, right now, to think this way. I mean, we need this vision of being a Christian and being a follower of Jesus, of protecting those people who need protection.
That's perfectly put in words. I mean, just listening to you gave me the goosebumps, because I know exactly what event you're talking about. And it's just, I have reimagined the event happening right in my head. So that's phenomenal. So if you have time, we'd like to ask some questions. We have received some on our YouTube channel, and I have some on my private that I have received some questions. So I guess the first question is, in America's current climate of polarization and misinformation, how can we move forward with bridge building and dialogue in the spirit of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him?
So you see this wooden board behind me, where my finger is, it says deuce. Okay. So deuce is my way of activating pluralism, right? So a lot of people will say, well, what is this energetic engagement with diversity at large? What does it look like? So deuce provides us with like a method. It's actually like a step-by-step method of combating polarization, if you want to call it that. And it stands for dialogue, education, understanding, commitment, and engagement. And, because I want to get to a lot of questions here, let me just say, any combating of polarization starts with talking with one another, but not this superficial chatter. That's where the education comes in. Like, you break the ice, you talk about, two groups of people come together and they talk about basic things. Like, what does it mean to be a father, a mother, a son? Talking about these things over food, building trust. Once you build trust, then you educate one another. This is when, if you want to bring the Quran and if you want to bring the Bible, you can sit down and you can educate one another because you trust one another. You've already broken the ice. Once you have educated one another through the dialogue as well, then you have a moment of like understanding. Whereas like when you can like look people in the eye and say like, this person gets it. They're my friend. I can trust this person. I can work with this person. Once you have that level of understanding, then you can sit down with one another and you could say, all right, let's plan something. Let's commit ourselves to certain values or a certain project. And then the E is doing that out in the public sphere, the engagement. So Deuce is a method that you can adopt in many ways to combat this polarization and to build stronger bridges of understanding.
Yeah, that's very true. So another question is, I guess I'll start with a reflection from one of our viewers. Says, hello, Dr. Considine. First of all, thank you so much for this beautiful book that you wrote, and also thank you for being with us this evening. Unfortunately, Islam is misunderstood by many people. So the question is, what do you think are the tasks for us Muslims to correct the false image of Islam in people's minds?
Ooh, I don't think there's one answer to that. And let me be clear too, like there's also a lot of misunderstanding of it. This isn't unique to Islam. Islam may have a bigger issue because the media is more anti-Islam, I think, than any other religion. But I'll point you to the media. I think I would like to see the narrative of Islam and Muslims change in the media by Muslims themselves actually getting involved in the media and controlling their own narrative. Because at the moment, when you turn on CNN or Fox or NBC or whatever, oftentimes it's not Muslims who are speaking on behalf of their faith. And we know that most of the negative perception of Muslims in this country, though I think a big part of it is unfamiliarity with Muslims themselves. Like, this is a huge country. It's a continent. A lot of Americans were like I was when 9/11 happened. They've never met a Muslim in their life. The only thing that they know is what they see on the TV. So I would like to see the narrative change by Muslims controlling their own narrative. I think that's really important.
Yeah, that's very important. Another question is, so you title your book, it's actually a pretty good question. You title your book as The Humanity of Muhammad, a Christian View. So as I was reading through the book, I thought it was pretty much a Muslim view too. What would you say about that?
Would say, yeah, I could see why people would say that, I think there are a lot of overlaps between these two great religious traditions, and during the Miraj, Muhammad's night journey to Jerusalem, he is said to have said, I am very close to Jesus, and we're like brothers, and like the only difference between us is basically our mothers, but like we're coming from the same source and we're the same essence and being. And I think that's true. And some may say, well, they're not the same. Well, I would say this, what I mean is, like, Christianity and Islam aren't the same, but I think it was Mustafa Akil wrote in his book, The Islamic Jesus, which is a great book, by the way. I really like that book. He said that Islam is not anti-Christian. He says that Islam is anti-Nicene. And the word Nicene is linked to the Council of Nicaea, which happened in 325 in modern day Turkey. And this is where the Trinity, which the Quran condemns, was made an official doctrine of the church. And Akal is essentially arguing, okay, like the Trinity was kind of implemented and established at this point in time. And that, Islam is not anti-Christian. It's anti-Nicene, anti-Trinity. And I think that's an interesting kind of way of thinking about the bigger picture between these two great faith traditions. In many ways, and this might be a controversial point, and I kind of talk about this in my next book, but some of the Christians that Muhammad was interacting with in his time, so like Waraka ibn Nafal, Bahira the monk, Nestor, even the Christians of Abyssinia, a lot of these Christians were basically considered by Constantinople and Rome to be heretics because their version of Christianity lost out in all of these councils. Wow. So in some ways, like Muhammad, I'm not saying Muhammad is a Christian. I'm not, I understand, like, a lot of people will take that and run with it and say I'm saying something different. But like in many ways, there are a lot of similarities between some of these early Christian sects, who did not believe in the divinity of Jesus, who just said Jesus was a great prophet and he's the Messiah, but he's not the Son of God. And I think the Quran would agree with that in many ways. So I kind of got off on a little tangent there, but hopefully that was insightful.
So one thing that we mentioned before is the sign on the back, and one of our viewers are asking, what does it mean for you, I guess?
I mean, it's a way of life. It's a challenge. It's not easy to live your life in this kind of process of always engaging with people. Like I'm human as well. Like I'm just like everyone else. Like there are some people who, like, there are some times where I don't want to engage with people. Like there are some people that, for lack of a better term, that I don't want to associate with. But that's not what it means to be a Christian. Like we as Christians are called and commanded to love our enemies. I mean, it's a challenge. So deuce is a way of life, but it's also a reminder to, to try to be better, to always try to be in progress, to break down some of these barriers.
Thank you very much. And I think this will be the last question. I know we said that would leave some time, and I think we actually went through a lot of the questions that were asked for. So the last one I think is very applicable is, what would you tell to Christians who criticize your work? Why would you engage with Islam or Muslims the way you do? And how can you address the criticism from our own faith and communities?
I would say to Christians that question my work, to borrow a classic American slogan, which is common sense, right? So Thomas Paine is writing in the 1770s that it's, part of the element of common sense is to not be taxed without representation in government, which makes sense, right? Common sense today has to have a different meaning. Christians and Muslims, if you combine these populations right now, make up half of the human population. All of the people in the world, half are part of these two groups, a massive figure. The United States has also been heavily engaged in Muslim majority countries around the world, oftentimes through war, which is not good. And I hope that people don't like war because it leads to death and destruction. So also, Muslims are a significant population in this country, and they will only become more significant in the future. It doesn't make sense for Christians to not know at least the basics of the Islamic faith. So I would push Christians into thinking that this is actually, it's important, not because of religious or faith reasons. Like these are practical things. Like we have to get to know this massive group of people because we're connected to them. So that's what I would say. I would try to make it like rational and practical and factual, rather than saying, oh well, the Quran says this, or Prophet Muhammad was a good guy. Like I don't think that would work. You have to kind of sell it in a different way.
Well, thank you very much. That was the last question that we had. Everybody, please check out Dr. Craig's book. It's available on Amazon. And if you'd like to see more events like this, please follow and like the video that we have streamed today. Follow NOICA on social media, and please check out our website. Dr. Craig, thank you very much again for tonight's event. I really appreciate it, and it was a pleasure and amazing opportunity to listen to you on live show like this. So thank you so much. And I would like to remind everybody that our next event is going to be on March 11th. So please stay tuned. Please check out our website, and please be tuned with our social media, and we'll be updating our event schedule pretty shortly. So I'd like to conclude for the day. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you again very soon.
Thanks, everyone. God bless. Take care.
Bye, everybody.